Great. So I am very happy to introduce Dr. Eveline de Smalen, my former colleague and the best office mate I ever had. Eveline is a literary scholar who works on literatures of coastal and riverine landscapes. She has a particular interest in the transformative capacities of the imagination and the interactions between the realm of the imagination and that of policy and politics. Her most recent publication is Reading Poetry for Policy, a study of Spurn Point in green letters. And I'll send a link in the chat to that one. And together with Fikas Lakani, she edited the RCC Perspective volume, Sites of Remembering, Landscapes, Lessons, and Policies. And there's a link to that one as well. Eveline studied English and Comparative Literature at Utrecht University and completed her PhD in Environmental Humanities at the Rachel Carson Center in 2019. She is currently a postdoctoral researcher in the project Corridor Talk, Conservation Humanities and the Future of Europe's National Parks, which is funded by the DFG and AHRC. And there's, if I can copy it, there's a link to that one as well. And she is currently a visiting fellow at Integrated Research on Energy, Environment and Society, IRES, I think, at the University of Groningen. So for her current project, she works on the cultural imagination of the Wadden Sea, and I think we will hear about that now.
Yes, thank you. So now I'm going to attempt to share my screen, this time. Okay, good. So then I'll start by saying thank you to everyone who is here for attending this talk. I'm very happy to see so many of you here, and thank you to the organizers, Lina and Elina, for inviting me to present here. It's a really great opportunity, and I'm really grateful for to be asked to do this. So as Elina said, my project is part of the Corridor Talk Network, which is a group of researchers at the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society at the LMU Munich in Germany and the University of Leeds. And our aim as a group is to contribute with our research in the humanities to conservation practices in the real world. So we're working on in different fields. Me and my colleague Katie Ritson, we are in literature, and we have historical research and also in research in geography. And for this project, we work together actually with people from different national parks. So people in the Wadden Sea, but also in the Pyrenees, the Bavarian Forest and the Samoa National Park. And we are trying to see how we can contribute to improving these people's work with our research. So I myself focus on literature in the Wadden Sea area. And I wrote my PhD thesis on the imagination of nature in cities and the Rhine-Maas Delta in the Netherlands and the Humber in the UK. So I was already working on ideas of place before I started this project. And I was really excited to work on this region with this great ecological significance and really interesting things about conservation going on. So I have a map of the Wadden Sea here. You can see that it stretches from the north coast of the Netherlands to Germany and the west, or part of the west coast of Denmark, up to Esbjerg. And it's an intertidal area, which means that twice a day it empties for a large part and then floods again. And as you can see, there's a string of islands stretched across it. It's a UNESCO Natural World Heritage Site, and it is also very well known in the Wadden Sea countries for tourism. So lots of people go there on their holidays, especially during the COVID crisis, because we can't travel internationally in the way that we used to be able to before. And these islands are a bit more accessible for us. So I have some pictures also of the Wadden Sea to show you what kind of landscapes I'm going to be talking about. So we can see some sandbanks and mudflats and the sea. So as I started reading different texts about the Wadden Sea and novels set in the Wadden Sea area, I found that I wasn't reading about place in the same way that I had been used to from doing my PhD project. So rather, I felt like I was reading about nowhere. And I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about what I mean by that, and what that means for conservation, and what we can do with these insights. So I'm going to structure this talk around the 4 key words that are in the title of this presentation: nowhere, somewhere, elsewhere, and here. And I'll give some examples of how the ideas that come with these words show up in literature of the Wadden Sea area. I'm going to end with a short consideration on issues in conservation for which these insights from literature are relevant, and how we see the role of literature in the world vis-a-vis these practical issues. So I'm going to start with talking a little bit about the context of these words and what I mean by them. So the first time I started thinking about these words was when I was writing my master's thesis in 2015. I was writing about W.H. Auden, and I read his poem In Transit. This is a poem about changing planes at an Irish airport, and I have a picture here that shows the particular airport in question at about the time that the poem was written. So this poem is interested in the same abstractions of place that I want to address in this talk. And so it's quite useful to look at this poem first to see how these words have been used before, almost as concepts, in the way that I want to use them in this talk. So this is the wrong one, actually. The poem mentions the word somewhere, which is where I want to start, twice. Somewhere is a place that we know, that has a history that we're familiar with, and circumstances and habits that we understand. Quote, somewhere are places where we really have been, dear spaces of our deeds and faces, scenes we remember as unchanging, because there we change, where shops have names, dogs bark in the dark at a stranger's footfall. And then in contrast, the airport where the poem's action is situated, quote, a point selected jointly by general staffs and engineers, unquote, is referred to as nowhere. This is a place that is not known and will not be known, and has no importance to the speaker or anyone else, except as a tool to leave it. The passengers are, quote, unrelated today or to Mother Earth, in love or in hate. Our occupation leaves no trace on this place or each other who do not. And then finally, there's the elsewhere. The elsewhere appears in this poem not as something that occupies the speaker. This is an idea that is located outside of him in the mind of another person. The speaker looks out the windows of the airport at the Irish landscape and imagines someone else looking back. And that person is the one with the elsewhere on their mind. Quote, through modern panes, I admire a limestone hill I have no permission to climb, and the pearly clouds of a sunset that seems oddly early to me. I guess he's jet lagged. Maybe an ambitious lad stares back, dreaming of elsewhere and our godlike freedom. Now, the fact that this thinking or dreaming of elsewhere is not something that the speaker does themselves, but that the hypothetical boy, who may or may not be there, is doing, is quite fascinating. Because really, if this boy is dreaming of elsewhere, the speaker who is at an airport is actively pursuing it or coming back from it. It's unclear whether the poem speaks about an outbound or a homeward journey. The speaker is cut off from the limestone landscape where they imagine the boy to be, because it is inaccessible due to the airport rules that the poem discusses at some length, but also because he has no intention or desire to climb it. It's not his destination. So locating this thinking of elsewhere, not with the speaker, as is the case with the mentions of somewhere and nowhere, which are places that are relevant to the speaker. The somewhere is a place that he knows, the nowhere is a place where he is. But instead, the elsewhere is with a third party. This reinforces its foreignness and makes the elsewhere itself elsewhere. And this foreignness is exactly the essence of elsewhere. It is a place that is away from what is known, a place that is defined not so much by what it is as what it is not. It is in that sense a negative space. It is not its physical characteristics or conditions that make it remarkable, but the absence of the characteristics and conditions that we know. Now this brings me finally to the Wadden Sea, because this notion of elsewhere also appears in many texts about the Wadden Sea. So one example is Vonne van der Meer's 1999 novel Eilandgasten, Island Guests. And this is a novel that is set on Vlieland, which is the second island from the west that I've indicated with this orange arrow here. And the Eilandgasten is a book about a house that is rented out on Vlieland, and the island and the house and this entire setting become this elsewhere type space throughout the book. So the book is about this summer house called Burnet Rose. It's named after a type of rose that is quite common on the Dutch coast. And it is rented out by an anonymous landlord who remains unknown to the reader and to the house guests who holiday there. We do meet the cleaning lady who narrates the opening and the ending of the book, and who the different guests see as she cycles by the house every day. The main part of the book is taken up by 5 chapters, which all focus on a person or a different group of people who occupy the house at some point during a particular summer. The stories are all unrelated on the surface. They're all contained and limited to the group of people that they are about. But they're still connected through the house, through items left and found by different guests, and through the guest book that is read and written in. Now, unlike the landlord, who remains unknown throughout the novel, the cleaning lady is presented in such a way that she's instantly familiar. She does not only work in the house, but is personally invested in it. And through her care for the house, the reader becomes interested in it too. The cleaning lady provides the first hint that the connection between narrative and place will be a very important one in this book. And she asks of the people who write in the guest book, quote, "Why have these people come to the island?" And this is the question that the book then supposedly answers through the stories of the different people who come there and experience the island. So the cleaning lady is not only invested in the house, but she identifies herself with it. She says, quote, "Sometimes I wish I did not only clean this house, but that my arms were the walls, my eyes were the windows, that I could see and hear what Burnet Rose experiences." And then the last hint that she provides as to the relation between place and narrative is when she tries to imagine which spot in the house would inspire the most productive or prolific guest book writings in the house's guests. And then finally she decides to put it on the sofa. Quote, "I'll put it here on the corner sofa. When the sun sets and it is too cold to go to the beach, the guests are here. If I lived here, I'd want to sit here on the sofa in the evenings. You can see down the entire Badweg to the last dune before the sea. It is the most beautiful spot, with these bushes crawling up to the house. When the Burnet Rose blooms in May, you sit here amongst the flowers. Yes, I'll put it down here." So as I said before, throughout the book, we supposedly find out the answer to the cleaning woman's question. Why have these people come to the island? And indeed, place is important to all of them. They all describe the outdoors and the special atmosphere of Vlieland. One of them, for example, talks about, quote, "Rustling bushes with leaves that seemed made of silver. This was the part he loved the most. On cloudy days like today, when the Wadden Sea was grey, the grass on the dike was also grey-green, and the leaves of the bushes on both sides of the road seemed a shade lighter, as if the salt had eaten away the green." Now, structurally, the stories are also similar. All stories focus on a person, a family, or a group of people who experience some kind of life crisis, from a cheating husband to the death of a wife to a missed promotion at work. And all of these crises are worked through and in one way or other resolved during the holiday on Vlieland. The cheating husband is forgiven, the grieving widower decides he can continue living without his wife, and the wronged employee counts his blessings and carries on living. And these significant personal transformations are connected explicitly to the circumstances of the holiday and the location of Vlieland in which it takes place. So take this passage, for example, in which the character who's been passed up for a promotion reconciles himself to his fate by synchronizing his breath with the sea. So, quote, his breath synchronized with the other breath, the breath of the sea. When he listened to it, he automatically became more peaceful. It was time he cycled past the silver bushes without thinking of money and counted his blessings rather than the pay raise of Den's Bookhoven. So it is helpful to keep in mind here the Lawrence Puel's checklist for what he considers environmental literature. So I put it up here for your reference, but I'm not really going to talk about it in detail. Anyway, what this list alerts us to is that while the environment is very important to the novel and its characters, the text bears barely any indication that the environment is a meaningful factor outside of the lives of the island's human visitors or inhabitants. In this book, the island mostly exists to provide a service, namely to comfort the visitors, and therefore we never really get to know the island. In the Wadden poem, the elsewhere was located entirely outside of the poem's realm and not elaborated on. It was a dream in someone else's mind. Here, the location is very vividly described, but it remains in elsewhere, a site that mostly exists in the minds of the characters who encounter it. Here, as in Wadden, place is a dream as much as anything else. So there's a Dutch author called Matthijs Deen who has written a history of the Dutch Wadden Islands. And in this history, he also talks about this transformative capacity of the Wadden Islands, or at least this imaginative understanding of the islands as transformative places. He writes about the Wadden Islands as, quote, mythical places where life loses its gravity. He writes that he himself has also experienced this imagination of this mythical island, and he notes that there are two components that enable this myth. On the one hand, quote, it was most of all about being away from the mainland, relaxing in this other world, unquote. And on the other is the fact that the destination is specifically an island. Quote, a little universe I could oversee when I climbed the dune, safely embraced by the sea that kept the outside world at bay, a combination of freedom and security, unquote. But while Matthijs Deen powerfully describes this experience of this myth, he also dismantles it as something that exists in his mind, his imagination, and the imagination of many people, and even generations of people who have engaged with the islands in some way or other. And he writes, quote, it was a fragile, vulnerable, and therefore at its heart, a dark idyll. Because of course, it wasn't true. An island alone doesn't heal wounds, and the sea is not generous, but mostly indifferent, unquote. The idea of elsewhere shows that people connect with places and landscapes in profound, meaningful, and transformative ways, which are very important to them. But still, at the same time, they can be fundamentally detached from the landscape on a more granular level. And this is specific to their being foreign, strange, and away from home. So let's move from elsewhere to nowhere. In the Wadden poem, nowhere was the airport. It was nowhere because it was not connected to anything known. It had no memories imbued in it. It was not meaningful to the speaker. It was also a stopover, a place that the speaker didn't necessarily want to be. It was not a transformative site in that sense, but a transitional one. The text I want to discuss in this part of the talk is Op Zee, or At Sea, by Ton Hermans from 2011. And this is also about a place that is understood by the narrator as one that has no connections to the places that they know and are at home in. But other than in the Wadden poem, this lack of connections is exactly what draws the narrator of the book to this place, and the fact that it is nowhere is sought after especially. So Opzij is the story of Donald, who is a Dutchman who is completing the last leg of his trip, sailing trip along the North Sea. And we see him travel from Denmark to Harlingen in the Netherlands. You can see Harlingen on the west part of the larger north part of the Netherlands. And most of the action takes place in about the general region where this orange arrow is between, just before the passage between the islands of Vlieland and Terschelling. So Vlieland is again the second island from the west, and then Terschelling is the next one over. So Donald narrates his experiences as a recreational but experienced sailor. He traverses the North Sea with his 7-year-old daughter. We understand him generally as sympathetic, if slightly quixotic. He is more than a little obsessed with seeming like an ideal father sailing with his ideal daughter. And the narrative becomes more problematic when Donald's ship enters a storm and he loses his daughter Maria overboard. Until in the final chapters, it is revealed that Maria was actually never with him to begin with, but instead with her mother on shore. And he is not at all an experienced sailor, but arrives home with both himself and the ship on the verge of ruin. The novel's setting is at sea in a nowhere-like setting that Donald experiences as empty, with himself as the man alone at sea who faces the elements successfully. He presents himself as disconnected from other people and other places. However, throughout the novel, Donald is shown to be not at all disconnected from his environment, but fundamentally in touch with the local community in the Wadden Sea region. While he draws on this tradition of representation in imagining himself alone with nature in the Wadden Sea, local inhabitants are always present on the margins of the text, reminding the reader, if not Donald, who is a little oblivious to this, of the complexity of human life that exists alongside the many visitors, like Donald, who present the Wadden Sea to the wider world. So when the storm approaches Donald in the narrative, an operator from the Maritime Traffic Control Center, Brandaris, on Terschelling, contacts him to check on him. And he discusses Donald's plans with him and keeps an eye out for him during the storm. When Maria disappears, the only reason that help does not arrive is because Donald refrains from calling for it. This is, of course, very worrisome at the moment when this happens, when the reader doesn't know that Maria is not actually there. But later it becomes more apparent why it is that he hasn't called for help, because Maria is with his wife on shore. So even though he doesn't call for help, he practices a Mayday call and imagines the many people on the island and on the mainland who would come to his aid when called. Quote, Den Helder rescue, the lighthouse keeper in the lighthouse of Terschelling. A helicopter will come from Vlieland. Big men, seamen. And after his ordeal, he is again in touch with the operator, Brandaris. So in this way, the book shows that the interests and sensibilities of these occupants of the Wadden Sea can be ignored, like Donald does, but they can never be denied. Now, Opzij is an illustrated novel, and the illustrations also make some really forceful commentaries on the theme of connection in the book. So this illustration, for example, shows a row of lighthouses, which can be identified from left to right or from east to west, as Donald sees them approaching from the north, as the lighthouses of Schiermonnikoog on the left, then Ameland, Terschelling, Vlieland, and Texel on the right. And they're towering over Donald's small boat, depicted amongst outsized waves. The lighthouses tower imperiously and combine their bundles of light into one beam. It is clear that this is their territory, and the boat is an outsider. Yet, the boat is caught in the middle of the lighthouse beams. They make him a focal point within the landscape. The idea of nowhere, in a sense, erases the local. but this connection between ship and lighthouses negates this erasure. The illustration on the title page has a similar function. This illustration shows the back of Maria's head with two braids streaming down her shoulders and connecting below her to form a sea that holds a small boat. This image is echoed in the initial Eveline chapter, which similarly seems to represent hair, streaming water, or algae. And you can see this here. So in this, it unites the divided scales that enabled Donald to pursue this fictional escape from home and arrive nowhere. The very small scale of algae are connected to the larger scale of Maria and the much larger still scale of the waves that carry Donald's boat. Everything's entangled. Now the islands or the Wadden Sea can thus be read as elsewhere or nowhere, which are pretty closely related and may sometimes be the same thing. But whether the text itself or a critical reading of it exposes it, place as this transformative and mythical site in this context always ends up being a myth. And it is closely connected to the disregard of others. So let's now move to the final words that I want to discuss today. In Wadden, somewhere is a place that is familiar, known, and dear to the speaker, that exists in contrast to the anonymous place that they find themselves in. But I want to talk about this known and loved place, the somewhere, as a place that is not only known and loved, but experienced directly, where the speaker of the poem that I want to discuss in this section finds herself at the time of narration. Perhaps then not somewhere, but here. The text I want to talk about in this section is a poem by Eveline de Smalen called Ruimtevrees, or Fear of Space, or Fear of Open Space. It was first published in a poetry collection called Uitzicht Genoeg, or Plenty of View, from 2013, and then again earlier this year in a book called Je keek te ver, or You Look Too Far. And this is the book that I found the poem in, and it is an essay about walking in the area around the author's hometown, which is called Zeerijp, and I've indicated that with an arrow here. So even though the poem doesn't have a specific place that it can be pinpointed to because of this connection with the text, I've given this particular map, this particular arrow. And I guess in a way it's funny that the only text that I'm going to talk about that is somewhere, that is in a specific place, that is very particular, is the only one I cannot pinpoint on a map. So there's that. Yeah, so moving on. Island Guests was a novel of transformation, and this is a poem of transformation. However, it is not the people who experience personal transformations as much as the landscape that transforms in the speaker's eye and the speaker who transforms in the face of the landscape. On a formal level, these transformations are reinforced by turns of phrase that appear throughout the poem that are common in the Vos's poetry. As for example, in the following lines. Quote, "The view is you with itself in space, where arrival is far and searched far and wide." So I want to make a note here that all the quotations that I've provided of the Dutch text, I've translated myself. And especially as we are now going to talk into about like this poetic language on a really really closely. I want to say that I'm not a translator and I'm not a poet. So I've tried to give some sense of the poem's content and feeling, and I haven't been able to be entirely accurate in my translations or be entirely poetic. So you have to excuse the clunkiness on both sides of the matter here and bear with me. But everything that I'm going to say about this English translation also applies to the Dutch, of course. So I've tried to somehow find a compromise here. So to repeat the quote, "The view loses you with itself in space, where arrival is far and searched far and wide." So here we have a reversal in the fact that the site loses the seeing subject. The view loses you. And that pointed reversal is amended slightly when it itself is also lost, but still it is the sight performing the losing of itself, and not the human viewer getting lost in seeing, if you're still with me and I've clarified something instead of obfuscating it. So all these estranging twists of language happen under the influence of the sight, the landscape or space, that makes it something transformative and nearly magical. And this continues in the next line. Here we see something of an oxymoron. Arrival is far. And the word far is then repeated in another context and in a specifically idiomatic use. The word far itself, of course, implies distance. And the oxymoron adds to this distance because it is not immediately clear what arrival is far implies. The idiom then, by repeating far, and by being figurative language, then adds another layer of distance. Through the repetition of far in different syntactical contexts, another transformation is hinted at, a lexical one this time. And the next two lines repeat this play with syntax and semantics. Quote, "Not for the drake which suddenly and irrepressibly green swims into the sunlight and your view." So a duck is said to appear suddenly and somewhat strangely, irrepressibly. And through this caesura, it is indeed suddenly that we see this glorious color green in the duck in the next line. And then, moving on, we find a twist of words not unlike that of far. The bird swims into the sunlight, which we may picture fairly literally as it moves from a patch of shadow into a patch of light. But then, with your view, a shift is made from a literal to a figurative swimming into. So here we have another estrangement or transformation. With these techniques, Marlene de Vos performs this trick that poetry is widely known and celebrated for, particularly nature poetry, that of defamiliarization. And after this defamiliarization, the poem presents a recommendation, a message. After these transformations of language mixed with landscape, the subject and the reader are themselves also transformed. The speaker urges, and the reader is implied to be compliant, to look in a particular way and to experience their surroundings with a particular attentiveness awakened by the earlier defamiliarization. Quote, "Feel warmth on your nose, see the early leaf of elder. You looked too far. That which you sought is here." So here we have this recommendation, the message. We've gone through transformations of language mixed with landscape, and now we are ourselves transformed, or at least our way of looking is. Here the setting, the landscape, functions because of its proximity, its closeness, and its intrinsic qualities that exist independently of the observer. And this irrepressible duck is perhaps the best symbol of that. So transformation is the red thread that runs through all these texts and is related to all key words of this presentation. Nowhere, elsewhere, somewhere, and here. The characters in Eilandgasten were transformed under the influence of the idea of elsewhere. And the critical view of nowhere transforms the reader and their understanding of the main character in Opzee. And then in de Vos's poem, the reader and addressee's view of landscape and their position in it are transformed. So what these key words show are different ways of engaging with sights, based on different relations with them as home or not home, which are all meaningful in different ways. This says something about the process of placemaking, which is often described as the addition of meaning to a place. So places or a space becomes a place when people live in it and experience it and make memories and narrations about it. And this addition is what makes a space a place. And in these texts, placemaking is rather shown as a transformation that takes place in the interaction of subject and site. This understanding of different ways of placemaking and different ways in which places are meaningful for people, inhabitants and visitors alike, is relevant to conservation issues. So in debates about conservation in the Wadden Sea, there are different issues that relate to different themes in this talk. So for example, there are scholars who argue that conservationists do not really adequately work together with local communities, and they do not really take into account their habits and their desires and their ideas about the landscape. Literary research, for example, can show ways in which the concerns of communities are valid, but also, in the case of Vonne van der Meer and Ton Hermans, in very different ways, that the disregard of communities is not something that is limited to conservationists in this particular context, but it is part of a much larger national cultural imagination. And at the same time, there are debates about how to take into account the desires regarding the Wadden Sea of people who do not live there, but are still invested in them emotionally. So these people may live elsewhere in the country or in the continent or in the world, but they still deeply care about it, whether they visit it or not. And literary research can show how people form these attachments with place, even though they are not there, and what these attachments mean to them, and thus provide insights into this question. How do we deal with these people in what we do? So this leads me to the question of what contribution the humanities could and should make in practical conservation issues. And this goes to the heart of what conservation humanities and perhaps environmental humanities is about. And I myself, I just started thinking about this and I haven't really come to any great conclusions yet. And it is also a question about how we see the role of literature in the world. Because in a way, reading literature for practical uses, as I've described earlier, is reading it instrumentally, while literature is a fundamentally instrumental medium. It doesn't typically argue or have a direct goal, and that is part of why many of us love it. At its best, it can show us nuances and complexities of many kinds that make our lives richer, or show why our lives are so rich. And this is also its main contribution in conservation humanities. It can show the richness and complexity of the matters at hand in ways that might remain invisible in other contexts. But while it may be useful to read literature this way, I think at the same time it is vital to be very careful in reading literature instrumentally. Literature is, in a way, something magical. It can be life-changing and extremely powerful and personal. Most of us here have literary backgrounds, I think. And this power of literature is probably why we are here and why we do what we do. We recognize and we have experienced and hopefully still experience this. And at this time and in this economy, we really, I think most of us have agreed that we cannot do without insights from literary studies, but we also need to keep appreciating it with detachment. So to end this talk, I want to encourage you to think about this tension, and I think both think about ways in which your own research applies to practical questions in the real world and how we can maybe use it to build a better one, but also how you see this balance and the place of literature in the world. So thank you.